Hi, Colin. Welcome to the Founders Podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me, Ash.
How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm doing great.
Great stuff. Before we start, Colin, do you have a favorite quote, something that inspires, motivates you, you would like to share with our audience?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I'm kind of an old school business book guy, and one of my favorite books, going back many, many years, is E-Myth Revisited.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a quote that Michael Gerber has in that book that says that even the most menial work is art when done by an artist.
Mm.
And I love that. I think that's, there's so many things in life and in work that we have to do tasks that we're not the most excited about. But it's kind of, it's a passion of mine to try and make them art nonetheless.
Yeah. I think I was reading it last time I was traveling towards the central. And I think I passed through the part where he mentions about there are always three people you need to run the business. One is the artist, one is the manager, and one is, I think, the businessman or something like that. I totally forgot it a couple of weeks back. That hit me hard because I think in founder's journey, you always focus on the quality of the service or product you're building or trying to deliver, and it's such a small but crucial part of running a business that you always overcome it or look into it, right? So that's pretty cool. So thanks for sharing this then. um let's say let's do something different today, Colin. Then imagine like we are in a room of full of ambitious founders and early stage builders, right? No one knows your name and you've just got few minutes to introduce yourself, not with your title or why, where you have worked before, etc., but with a story that explains why people should trust what you have to say, and that will become the reason for them to stick together for the rest of the hour.
Yeah, I appreciate that. That's a good twist. So, I would say that for me, I started in a family business when I was 21, just turning 22 years old. I didn't know anything about anything.
Mm.
And so for me, it's just really been the school of hard knocks and typically trying things the wrong way before I ever figured out the right way. And what I would say is that, I love the kind of concept that if you really understand something, you could teach it to like a third grader. Is
Mm-hmm.
that as I gained awareness and ability in business to really understand things, I simplified them. That was really what my passion was. And so from a pure kind of business standpoint and an economic, financial standpoint in the business, I always say, if I can understand how to make money in a business, I should be able to describe it on the back of a napkin. And
Mm.
so that's really kind of my logic. And when I really started to be successful in my first business, that's what it was. It came from not some really flashy marketing, not like you said, obsessing over the product even more. It came from understanding how we make money on the back of a napkin. And so that tells me very simply, like, what do I need more of? What do I need to be better at? Helps me get to the bottom of it.
Interesting, very interesting. And would you be also able to touch on the 3 points you would like to share today with our audience, which might come up
Yeah.
as a learning for them?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, I think for me, it's about how do you look at metrics differently in your business? So again, I kind of came up through the financial side of the business, not because I had any experience on the financial side, but because that was the area in the business that was the least taken care of. And so I think everybody gets intimidated when there's a bunch of financial statements and it all sounds like a CPA textbook that nobody wants to read. So I
Mm-hmm.
like to think of it just in terms of the metric. And then, figuring out what the number one driver of profitability is for every business. There usually is one main area where people are stuck. And so I'd love to kind of talk about that. There's a handful that I see over and over again and that I've experienced myself. And then the last one is, everyone is, even if you've got good books, let's say in your accounting, in your business, it feels like almost everyone I meet is driving down the road and they're looking out of the rearview mirror instead of looking forward while driving the car, right? And so that's kind of a big passion of mine, is help people solve for that.
Mm. Very interesting point. And I think these all 3 points actually touch the very core of a founder's journey, right? Let's talk about the metrics then. Um, in your opinion, or you might have helped hundreds of founders by now. Many founders track endless data points, but very few actually act on them. How do you define which metric truly matters in a business?
Yeah, I love that. And you're right. I see founders who either have too much data or no data at all. Is usually the two different varieties that I see. Um, what I like to say is one of the big challenges with small businesses is that the frontline people or anybody you've got on your team, they don't really understand anything about the numbers, about the financials. And so you've got one person who lives off in this space and they've got all the detail, and then everybody else who's trying to do the work who doesn't see any of it. And so we've got to kind of
Mm,
meet in the middle. And when you go back to like what metrics really matter, I like to describe it as what we call the critical unit, which is kind of a unit of measure. So think for a marketing company that does web design, it would be number of sites built or number of pages built. We get it down to like a unit of measure, and it has to be one that everybody on the team is familiar with. So if it were like a retail shop, let's say, it might be how many people walk in the door every day. And so everything we focus on is per visitor to the store. And then we kind of optimize from there, because if we take a metric that's something that just lives on the financial statements or it sounds too technical,
mhm.
then we kind of lose people along the way. But you'll notice really good businesses, whether they're restaurants or whatever, that are large businesses that have an engaged kind of frontline management team, it's always engaged on a level that they understand. Like how many people came to the restaurant today?
Mm,
That is something that every frontline manager is going to know. And I like to say that if the entire team could leave and say today was a busy day versus a slow day, we're in the right neighborhood of the right kind of metric that we need to be looking.
right. So you're saying that the real-time numbers are very crucial when it comes to, uh, managing successful businesses. What is your opinion on what's the danger of obsessing over surface level numbers like revenue or follower counts, or rather than meaningful indicators of growth? Because there is one part of founders who potentially have heard you, or they have learned it by doing mistake, and they only focus on things which basically matters when it comes to growth. But there are many other factors which comes as a data point in founders life which doesn't really matter when it comes to growth. So what's the danger of obsessing over them?
Yeah. I think to your point, what I love to do is we've got to get the financial metrics and whatever else we're sharing with the team and that we're obsessing, we have to connect them. And I think that's a huge gap. To your point, I came originally from a manufacturing environment. And in manufacturing, it's called global optima versus local optima, meaning if you put me in charge of this machine and you gave me enough raw material and I just kept my head down and I was really focused and I was a really productive worker, I might go crazy getting so much work done out of this one machine. And then at the end of the day, I look up and realize no one else in the company has gotten anywhere close to the amount of work I've gotten done. Now I have all this excess inventory. I've depleted all these resources. Like I've gone with the wrong goal.
Mm,
And so what we have to do with a business is kind of going back to that point. All businesses need, without question, all businesses need cash. That's the number one thing. So we have to make good, smart decisions that lead toward cash. All businesses, to be sustainable over a long period of time, whether they have cash right now or not, all have to be profitable. And so what I see with the founders who have so much data, and like you said, they're so lost in like adding even more things to track. A lot of times what they're tracking don't directly tie to either cash or profit. And so that's where I think the really successful bigger companies or more experienced companies, They tie what the people on the team experience every day to how does it make me more cash or more profit? And you teach the team that, and then you say, hey, go optimize this because the guy with his head down only worrying about one machine, he's hurting cash, he's hurting profitability by being so productive. And
Mm,
that's the huge breakthrough is like that didn't actually help the company today just because I put in a hard day's work.
mm. Very interesting. Very interesting. Um, there was an example. Have you ever heard about a guy named as Rory Sutherland? He was a vice chairman from Ogilvy Group. It's one of the biggest marketing company. He's a very well-known British marketing giant. I was listening to one of his talks, and you mentioned that um, there was one of the Michelin star restaurants in New York, which was at number 4. It was the smallest premise in terms of the carpet area, smaller number of people working for them, and within 9 months, it went from 4th to 1st. And you understand, like when you're in the top 1%, it is very difficult to go on the top by following just one small strategy. And what was the strategy? The strategy was whenever he used to have these special customers in the restaurant, he used to shuffle the cooks from the kitchen and the waiters, right? So so the cook actually makes the dish and he presents the dish uh, to the people who are going to consume it, and then after that, he usually what we do is we ask for feedback, like how did you feel about our service, or what is you think we can improve. The question he used to ask is simple: what have you felt was bad when you went to the three above us? So what was the service made you feel bad? He never cared about what did made you feel good or what was good in our institution. He always asked about what felt you what how you felt bad because you went to that restaurant, and then he used to 10x on that particular portion into his particular institute, and that's how he went from 4th to 1st within 9 months of time. And I think that's one thing which is can be relatable in this context, because it is important to basically understand like how your team is doing and this particular metrics in order to get ahead of others, right? Your competitors. Great. So, Cole, in your experience, how can solopreneurs or startups with 2, 3 founders reframe their metrics from being report cards to being tools for decision making? What is the best way to do it?
Yeah, I think the best way, like we described, is you need to know how you make money on the back of a napkin, and you need to understand how that cash process works through your business. So every business is a little bit different, but it's when do I expend my money and when does the client or customer pay me? How do those things kind of intertwine with each other? And then how are my expenses laid out? So I know that sounds really basic, but almost every decision is about trying to improve one of those things. And so if we don't know those kind of basic baselines, then we don't really know how to make better decisions. And for example, I would tell you that if we're not profitable enough, there are only 3 or 4 different things you can change to become more profitable. We need to figure out which of those is your focal point, because I think what's great, I love from the story that you told, is that there's 100 strategies that maybe could work, but at the end of the day, you need one strategy you're willing to go all in and commit to. And I think that for most businesses, we're spinning plates and we're going in a lot of different directions. And for most, especially founder-led businesses that are still small, your time is the greatest limiting factor. So figure out where it will have the greatest impact and put all of your energy there.
Because I think it's called something called which principle is this? 80/20? Um,
Yep. The Pareto
is
principle, 80/20.
Pareto principle.
Yep.
Yeah. It's always the 20% which actually brings the 80% of the results when you're working on something, you know.
What's craziest about the Pareto principle, the 80/20 rule,
Hmm.
is that it's fractal, which means that it repeats in the subsets of the 80/20. So you can actually take, for example, 80/20 means 20% of my input creates 80% of my output. I can 80/20 it again. And what I find is that only 4% of my inputs create 64% of the output. And that's true in any way you slice it. So all my sales come from 64% of my sales come from only 4% of my sales team, or 4% of my offer, whatever it is, 4% of my customers. When you know that, like you said, it creates an obsession to say, like, what if I stack all my time only focusing on those 4% areas that have the biggest impact? That's really what a founder should be doing, with their time.
Interesting. And I think there's one more element I wanted to cover in the metrics part, especially, which is if you could only track three numbers in a business to predict its health, which would you choose and why?
Yeah, so I would track revenue growth.
Hmm.
I would track operating income, and I'll come back to why here in just a second. And then I would track operating cash flow. So let's
Okay.
unpack those for a minute. Revenue growth,
Hmm.
everybody knows that one's simple. I've got to understand, because is this business flat? Is this business growing? Is this business declining? And if it's growing or declining, at what kind of rate? So I have to understand that to know how to make good decisions, and then know how to interpret the next two numbers, right? The next number is about operating profit. And so what that means, basically, the way I look at it is, if the business owner is loading up any other kinds of expenses, or there's, interest payments or depreciation or something that's kind of outside of normal operating, I'm not as worried about that at first. We have to make money selling our products or services. That is operating income. That's the number one thing I have to focus on. So, and then the last one is, am I generating cash by doing that? With those three numbers, that's the operating cash flow. With those three numbers, when two of them work and one of them is not, I can basically figure out why.
Hmm.
And if two of them aren't working, or all three of them aren't working, whatever the status is, kind of going back to, if you really hold me to three, I can basically diagnose, for the most part, what's going on in a business and why. And so, for example, we've got clients who, they're growing, they're profitable, and they have no cash. And so we figure out,
Interesting.
like, yeah, and we go, okay, but you're growing really fast.
Hmm.
And so what's happening is, your cash in your business moves slower than your growth does.
Hmm.
When that happens, even successful businesses can actually grow out of business. You can literally run out of money while growing, and you look great on paper if they just look at the P&L,
Hmm.
but in reality, you're broke. And so that exists, believe it or not. That's actually fairly common. And so with only having those three numbers, I've got to get numbers that I can kind of rely on.
That's very interesting because I always thought that people have this basic understanding of you if you're not making profit, or even if you're making profit, you kind of have some kind of contingency always left. But as you're saying, in your experience, plethora of businesses which are like other side of the wall. Uh, that's good. That's good. So let's move on to the profitability then, the second point we wanted to cover today. What do most founders misunderstand about what really drives profitability in their business?
Hmm. I would say the biggest misconception, there's actually two of them. So going back to you have to understand how your business makes money on the back of a napkin, right? So if we take that premise, the 4 or 5 different things that we're looking at there ultimately are the levers that you can pull to make more money. The things that are misunderstood, number one, is the just foundational impact, mathematical impact of pricing. So everybody kind of, it's totally normal when we're a newer company, or if we haven't, had this experience yet, we kind of think like, well, I just need to be priced around where everybody else is, and then I'll try and do it a little bit better. And then all of a sudden I'll have, I'll have a lot of customers. The problem is you can grow and have a big business that still isn't very profitable. And the normal reason why is pricing. There are only two major business models that exist. One is high volume, Amazon, Walmart, etc. And the other is a small premium offer. And that's it. Those are the only two successful models that you can actually make money at, meaning I can't be small and cheap. It just doesn't work. And so what you end up with is you end up with companies that they cut the corner on pricing. Then all of a sudden they don't have money left to do marketing. Good marketing leads to better pricing. But if I've cut the corner on pricing, now I cut the corner on marketing. Now I don't get enough leads. Now all of a sudden I have to win this one, so I better be cheap. It's just a downward spiral that you don't want any part of.
It's a vicious cycle. Yeah.
It is a vicious cycle. And so what we want is the opposite, right? We want the virtuous cycle of I've got good pricing that I'm confident in. Therefore, I'm able to invest in my product that I can be proud of and look people in the eye when I price it. I therefore have money for marketing, which I do, and I do well. And then I'm proud of my price again. And so we have to get on the other side of that. And the biggest head trash that I see with founders is around pricing, is they think that like pricing can come last somehow, instead of recognizing that pricing comes first. And a lot of people assign value based on price, whether it's true or not. If I tell somebody something costs $150 versus $1,500, they're going to have a different attitude about it. And so that's the first one. The big one I would say is pricing. If you just tied my hands behind my back and said you can only change one thing about businesses, what would they do differently? I would say raise your prices. It has that big of an impact. The other lever when it comes to, profitability is that's really kind of wild, is that most businesses have kind of a certain amount of fixed overhead. It's very dependent on the type of business, but like, let's say the difference between like what I was describing in the businesses earlier, if you're a restaurant, you've got rent, you've got, the expenses of just keeping the lights on. And maybe on a busy day, you have a little bit more labor than on a slow day, but there's kind of a baseline amount that you have to have. What's interesting is for every business, the profit in a really successful business actually comes when their size is great enough that it's the size in comparison to that baseline expenses that they have. So in other words, that's where the gap gets created. It's not that I'm doing this volume and my margins are great. Margins are really, really important. But it's actually when, for example, if a business has $1 million that it requires to break even, and then they go to 3 million, they're paying way more for people, way more for their cost of goods. Like their margin is still following them to 3 million. But if their overhead is built for $1 million, they're suddenly a very profitable company.
Very, very different way of looking at it, because if founders understand this small logic, it's beneficial for them, not just for the short term, but also for the long term game, right? Because
Yes.
you want to be into a long term gain, right? Colin, can you share a moment when improving a single process or a metric had an outsized impact on profit margin for one of your clients?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I would say, we've got a marketing company that we worked with, and the company actually, interestingly, was growing really well and they had really good cash, but they were not making profit. And it's because they weren't focusing on kind of those basic profit levers. And so what we worked on was, instead of them just looking at how much new sales they had that came in, what they were basically doing is they were looking at, we sold $100,000 and our team only cost 50. So we made 50. Well, but we haven't actually done that work yet. So bring in 100 of new client money in a model where the clients will pay you up front. It's kind of like fool's gold. It looks good. It feels good. but it's almost like a Ponzi scheme in the sense that you're living off of somebody else's money that you haven't earned yet. And when we actually got into their business, we realized that their business was not making money. They weren't producing work fast enough so that the more they were selling, it was just piling on. They had a ton of cash, and they're at the end of the month, they had more cash than last month. So therefore they thought they were really successful. The problem is they just had a backlog of work that kept growing and growing, more and more videos that were not finished that the clients wanted. And so obviously the huge threat there is that the clients come and say, hey, I want my videos. And now your team can't produce them. You can't afford to because you've kind of lived off of those down payments. So what we really worked on was getting it down to the kind of video level and then teaching the team, going back to what I was saying at the beginning, where we have to do it in language that the team understands. If I say, hey, team, what we're doing is we're creating all of this cash that's really a down payment. It's creating deferred revenue, and the deferred revenue is not coming through to the P&L. They're gone. They're lost. They have no idea what I'm talking about. So it's like, look, guys, we have to produce more videos. How many videos is each person getting done each day? And we have to ask the questions in those terms. How do we get more done? How do we get more done with less people and go faster and faster and faster? And so as we did that with that metric, it directly tied into the success of the company. And then we were able to show like what they were actually making money. And so they went from, they were basically breaking even, maybe they're 3%. And in 30 to 90 days, they go to like 32% profit because they're just going faster and faster and faster. Because what we're teaching the team is don't celebrate when the order comes in, celebrate when you get videos done.
That's very interesting. Was that your top of the funnel, your videos, or is it something in the middle, or how is that impacting directly with the profitability?
Yeah, well, so the team is being paid to produce videos. Only the salesperson's being paid to bring in new
The
videos.
customer.
And so the
Okay.
problem was everyone on the team is looking at the wrong metric, and the wrong metric doesn't actually mean profitability. So once we said, if this month you made 20 videos based on the size of this team, we are profitable. And so you have to kind of think of it again. I told you I came from a manufacturing background, but you almost have to think of it like an assembly line. All businesses are like an assembly line. There's the front end, which is the sales and marketing. There's the middle, that's the operations. And then there's the end, which is kind of the finance where we're either collecting cash or not, and that. And so we can't win the game with only one part of the assembly line running. It's kind of the equivalent I was saying of one guy who got a ton done today and then looked up and realized the rest of the company was going slow. It's not actually winning unless all parts of the line are moving, because what ultimately matters is what ends up coming off the line at the end, not how much I got done at my little station.
Indeed, indeed. That's super, super cool. And I think that's why it's important for founders to listen to these episodes where you have real world experience shared. Because imagine if somebody is running that kind of business, they already have well to do process to follow to get profitable. Great stuff. Um, how do you balance short-term profitability with long-term sustainability? I mean, we spoke about it a little bit, in your view, especially when scaling a lean business, because nowadays, if you go to a venture capitalist, I mean, last night I was in a dinner where we were like 22 people, all founders, VCs, and they were sharing their experiences. And most of them are lean businesses. So team of 5 or 10 people, making around 500,000 to 1.2, and they're producing a lot of value, not just with AI, but also otherwise. And they want to scale. So how do you balance that short term profitability with long term sustainability?
Yeah. So I'm a big believer. The Warren Buffett has a quote where he says, rule number 1 is never lose money, and rule number 2 is never forget about rule number 1. So it's kind of this idea that we can sacrifice some of our profits to pursue more growth or to reinvest of any kind, right? Like Some companies need to invest in their product. Some companies need to invest, and they think like, let me invest in hiring another person that we don't technically need yet, but we're about to need them, and I have to have them up to speed. Like, there's a lot of thought around what kind of reinvestment that people should take on, but there is no justification for that reinvestment, meaning you lose money. And so you have to kind of have that mindset, in my mind. And then really what we should be seeing is that successful growth means I'm more profitable, bigger than I was smaller. That is what successful growth means. And so if you unpack that, what that basically means is, yeah, I can invest in growth, but it has to be even more efficient than the investment I've made so far for growth. And if it is, and it works, then I don't have the same problem, right? I think what founders end up doing is they end up talking themselves into spending money on things that don't necessarily work because they're telling themselves, like, I'm making an investment, so this is okay. And the truth is, in a small, lean company, just like you're lean with your team, you have to be lean with your money, right? And so I can place a small bet, and if the small bet doesn't work, no big deal. I can't continue to place bets or place a big bet that will compromise my profit and find out I was wrong. We just can't do that.
Okay. And by not doing it, it helps us keeping our growth consistent so that our long-term scaling happens even though we are a lean business. Is that what we are trying to say?
Yes, I think that I've seen so many companies that scale really quickly especially for like a period of time.
Mm.
And they get to the bigger number and they realize they make less money or the same money that they used to make. And they're
Got
kind
it.
of like, how did that happen? But it's exactly what you're saying. To build something sustainable, you need a growth rate that is somewhat consistent. Some companies grow really fast, and if they do it consistently, they figure out smart ways to still be very profitable. But I rarely see a company that's been at a consistent, slow growth rate suddenly have a spike of growth and actually make the money that they thought they were going to make on paper.
Great. So Colin, thanks so much for that. I think we are ready to move on to this third part, which was, I think you mentioned around looking out the rear view mirror side of things, right? You've said that most businesses operate like they're driving while starting in the rear view mirror, right? What do you mean by that exactly? And what is it that makes those businesses do that?
Yeah, great question. So, the way that, I run a fractional CFO service. So basically we help companies effectively solve for the problem I'm about to describe. Most companies do bookkeeping of some kind. Hopefully you're actually recording your books. I actually find that really small businesses frequently just kind of live out of their bank account. That was the problem that the company I described earlier that was bringing in new sales, but they weren't actually profitable. They thought they were good because cash was the number one thing they cared about. But even when we do bookkeeping is about what happened last month. It's about what happened last quarter. It's about what happened so far this year versus last year. The problem is that to make decisions, we have to look forward, not just backward. And so what does that mean? That means that companies, yes, have to have a budget, right? Nobody likes the process of making a budget, but it's incredibly important that you put together a budget, even if it's a really simple one. And then the next piece is, okay, great. You have a budget for how much money you're going to spend. How much revenue are you going to have? And people, the minute I talk to people about that, they instantly say like, well, I mean, how can I possibly know? That's, next month, that's next quarter, that's next year. Like, I don't know how much money we're going to bring in. But the reality is that's what being a pro in business looks like. So every single public company, and I don't think we need to mimic what big public companies do all the time because I love the founder space. I love small business. But those big companies sit on a quarterly call where they say, well, last quarter, I told you we were going to do this amount of revenue and this amount of profit. And instead, we did this amount of revenue and this amount of profit. And every one of those calls is what their job is graded on. So we can't say it's impossible. There are thousands of people running public companies that's all they do. It really comes down to what are the variables that you don't understand that you would need to understand to do a good job of predicting? And so once we ask the question that way, now we're on the right path to figure out how to look forward instead of just back.
Yeah. Yeah. Because unless you do that, what's going to happen is you will end up, well, somebody at some point will end up exploiting all of your resources whenever, they think that you're vulnerable, or you might actually hit your own feet with a hammer and, you know, consume all the necessary resources you would have used at the right place, which what we have discussed in the profitability and the primary uh, elements of where we can make the profit, and potentially you just keep looking at the rear mirror. Interesting. That's a nice one. Um, what practical steps can founders or early stage, hustlers take to shift from, I want to say, reactive, backward looking decision to sort of like making to a more predictive or forward focused mindset?
Yeah. Well, I would say the first one is kind of what I just described, which is, whatever period of time you think you can reasonably do with your business, stretch it a little bit. So let's say the next 3 months, I'm going to write down how much revenue I expect to receive in the next 3 months. And then I'm going to write down my budget for the next 3 months. And I say write it down because it's just human nature. We all give ourselves the ability to make excuses, and we kind of have revisionist memory, right? Like revisionist history. We always say like, well, I knew that we weren't going to have this, or that. We start making excuses. So put it in writing. And so what I would do is I would say, here's what I expect in November, December, January. Then in a month, I would say, here's what I expect to do in December, January, February. Then a month later, it's January, February, March. So I'm always writing those down every month, and I'm comparing them to what I thought they would be last month. And that discipline, no one is good at it to start with. This is one of the things that I think people, they try it once and then they say, well, I was wrong, and so this is just kind of a waste of time. No. Everyone is terrible at it at first, but it's worth the exercise to learn how to get good at it, because the minute you miss, you go, why did I miss? Okay, great. Now you bring that into the next month when you make a better version, and you're just iterating and getting better.
That's cool. So, Colin, I mean, this conversation is going much deeper than what I was anticipating. We could actually talk and talk, but we have very limited amount of time. Before we go into our lightning round, I wanted to ask you something personal. Um, Throughout your journey and experience, there must have been valuable lessons learned. If you don't mind sharing, could you reflect on your experiences and tell us about one mistake or a setback that you encountered along the way that you now consider regret? And additionally, what advice would you give our listeners based on this experience?
Yeah, I think early in my career, I made the mistake of thinking that um, I knew I was fairly smart. I knew that I brought some things to the table, but I think I didn't treat myself like a professional the way that I needed to. And I love small business. I love that we don't have the formality that big business does. But that doesn't mean you don't need to invest in yourself and think of yourself as a pro, right? And so what does a pro mean? It means that you show up, you've got a plan, you're intentional, you're organized, you're disciplined. Those things aren't always easy for founders. The same type of personality that makes you a founder, some of those traits I just named are going to be very difficult. But again, you have to hold yourself accountable, because that's what a pro does, right? A pro expects more of themselves. And so I think the big thing that came from that was I had to be honest with myself about where my weaknesses were, like what things I didn't know anything about. Where was I not knowledgeable? And that still is going on today. I'm still working on, okay, what are the areas where I'm weak? What are the areas I need to grow in terms of my knowledge? And so I think the big kind of advice that I'd give to people that really changed my life is that I became an obsessive learner. And when I did that, instead of looking at a problem that I ran into or an area of weakness as something that was just like, well, hopefully everybody can get over it because I don't know anything about this. It turned into like the raw material for me to go learn more and go push myself. And that ultimately changed my life and really changed my career.
Thanks for sharing that. Really appreciate it. Great. So we have six quick fire questions for you in our quick fire round. If at any point you think you don't want to answer them, just give me a skip and then I can move on to the next one. You ready?
Okay. Absolutely.
Great stuff. What are the top three strategies or top three disciplines founders have to introduce into their businesses to make sure their finances is kept healthy for a longer period of time?
Yeah. I think I mentioned earlier profitability. Number two is you got to get your team engaged in making you profitable. Profit is not just the founder's problem. It has to be everybody's problem. So you figure out what that means. And then the last one I would say is just obsessing over kind of your costs. And nobody wants to do that. Nobody wants to go through the list of all the money they're spending. It's annoying. It's frustrating. You have to do it every so often, and you have to obsess over that and really have good command of it.
Awesome. What book would you recommend to our audience and why?
So if you want like a raw founder book, I would recommend there's a book called The Hard Thing About Hard Things by Ben Horowitz. He's super successful guy, early, I think, Facebook investor, very successful in Silicon Valley. But what I love is he talks about the raw grittiness of how tough it is to build a successful company. And I would say that part of what I love about founders is it challenges everything about who you are as a person. It requires every strength you have. It brings into focus every weakness you have, and it forces you to kind of level up your game. And so I love that book for making you feel better about the challenge that you're going through in the process.
Got it. I'm gonna put that into my reading list into Kindle so that I
Yeah,
can
it's a
give
good
it a
one.
go. What attribute or characteristic in your mind of a successful founder?
Passion, and then a willingness to bring discipline to the table. And I think
Kind of
that,
grit.
yep, those two
Yep.
things, right? And so passion, that's just excitement and big talk, that doesn't go anywhere.
Mm.
At the same time, the reason founders exist is because we have that, right? In other words, there are plenty of people in the working world that just have discipline and they're just good soldiers and you tell them what to do and they're going to do it. And that's how it is. That is not what creates an exciting company and a great company. It really requires both. And so for whatever part of that you have naturally versus the part you have to work on, you got to figure out how to get both.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. What's your favorite personal productivity tool or habit?
I would say spend deep thinking time to get absolute clarity on what your vision is. And I say vision, it could be product vision, it could be for your company, it could be the vision for where your team's headed. I believe that is the number one thing. And what I find is that in areas that I'm not as comfortable, like maybe I don't have the confidence in this area of the business, or it's an area I haven't spent enough time thinking about, I don't have good clarity. So I kind of look at if I can't tell someone exactly what my vision is, I haven't spent enough time developing that vision. Because there's a great quote that says, the worst thing in the world is running enthusiastically in the wrong direction.
Mm.
And so, right, vision means I know where I'm headed, period.
Yeah, yeah, the direction. It's very
Yep.
important.
Huge.
It's cannot explain how important it is for our listeners to listen this who are right now into their 9 to 5 and they're trying to get into the founder space. This is like one of the paramount of the decisions they have to make once they're into the vertical. That's like non-negotiable. Thank you. What's a new or a crazy business idea you would love to pursue if you had time?
I would love to pursue. New or crazy? That's a really good question. I mean, it's not new necessarily, but there is a ton around, that's obviously been very successful people with digital products. And I think that AI takes that to the next level. I think there's some really fascinating things that are going to be coming down in terms of, how to leverage AI into an actual product or service that you can sell. I think that, and where I think that gets really interesting is what makes the news is all of the big AI companies, right? All of the big AI um, creators, let's say. Um, but where it gets really interesting as a business to me is it's kind of like when they talked about the gold mining, that the people who made money were not the people who went and did gold mining. Gold mining is trying to make AI yourself. It was who sold shovels to the people who were trying to gold mine and really go pan for gold and find gold. So how do you sell the supplies? How do you help people along that journey they're naturally going to take with or without you? That's where you can create an interesting business.
Cool, cool. What's an interesting or fun fact about you that most people don't know?
Yeah, I'd say, I'm so obsessed with learning now, but I was a terrible student as a kid. I really just kind of fell out of love with school, and it wasn't interesting to me in middle school and high school. And so I barely graduated high school. And it took me a few years into my 20s to kind of get some things figured out. But ultimately, I got my executive MBA once I was passionate about learning about business and really obsessive about it. But somehow along the way, I never got my bachelor's degree. So I have a master's degree, even though I don't have a bachelor's degree, which is definitely a bit odd. And I have an executive MBA from what was at the time one of the top 20 in the country for executive MBA programs. And I was a bottom 10% student in my high school. So,
Very interesting.
yeah. So I think it goes to show you when you really we talked about passion and discipline. When you combine those things, which I did around learning and focusing on business, there's nothing that could stop you if you have those two things.
Indeed, indeed. Colin, thank you so much for joining me and sharing your story, unpacking all these wisdom from your past work and help you're doing to other people. What is the best way to get in touch with you if people have any questions, if they want to get in touch and ask you for some help?
Yeah, absolutely. Probably the easiest way is LinkedIn. I'm pretty active on LinkedIn. You could also go to our website, which is just finelevate.com. And again, we're a fractional CFO service. We work with companies usually between 1 and 20 million where they've outgrown living out of their bank account as their main accounting method, and they're looking to get to the point where they're big enough that they can really have full-time people that, do that. So we kind of help fill that gap. And that's what I love. I'm obsessed with entrepreneurship. I love working with founders. I love the big vision. And so, yeah, we bring that other piece to the table that most of the people we work with, they either don't have time for it, don't understand it, or don't enjoy it.
Got it. Colin, thank you so much for joining us today and sharing your inspiring journey and the impactful work you're doing. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on Founders Podcast.
Yeah. Thanks for having me, Ash.